Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, radio and television host Thom Hartmann is going to talk about the crimes of the oil industry and why it's time for them to pay up for destroying this environment. And corporate lobbyists have stalled or completely killed a host of government regulations, and we'll tell you why their greed is putting American lives at risk. And middle-class Americans have become an endangered species thanks to wage theft and benefit cuts. We'll tell you all about it. We'll have all of that and more coming up. And right now, you just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
The oil industry is responsible for countless oil spills, a large portion of America's CO2 emissions, and for gouging consumers at the pump. In spite of that, they pull in billions of dollars in subsidies from the federal government, from you as taxpayers. It's time that the oil companies paid for their crimes, and I've got radio and TV host Thom Hartmann with me now to talk about that. Thom, the Republicans still may not believe that there's such a thing called climate change and that it's created by man, but the World Bank sure does, don't they? You did a great story talking about the World Bank's position on this. It's they get it.
Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary, Pap. In November, just a few months ago, or 6 or 7 months ago, the World Bank issued this really long, detailed, very beautifully done four-color report, which they have been working on for several years, that basically said if we continue on the path we're on, we're headed for a 4-degree warmer world, maybe 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. That's like up to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. And that could be an utter disaster. It could even be an extinction event. And we've got to stop it at 2 degrees. And the problem, and they kind of mentioned this in passing or grazed against it, but they don't pretend to be climate scientists. But the problem is that we are already up 0.8 of a degree Celsius. And whatever you have done, the equivalent of that is in the pipeline. The exact same amount is going to come on. So we're already committed to 1.6 degrees. And the World Bank is saying, put a screeching halt to it and stop it at 2, or it's going to be a disaster for the world economy.
Yeah, okay, but you still have the regular suspects. Listen, you had the insurance industry, if you remember 10 years ago, Thom. They were preparing for global climate change because they said that the hits that they were going to take, they couldn't handle. And so they were trying to adjust 10 years ago while you still had all of the dull-brained suspect Republican paid-for politicians out preaching the idea that this wasn't real. So now you have the banking industry that understands the externalities, right? I mean, that's what this is about. What they've done is shifted those externalities to the American public. Talk about that.
What this is about, Pap, is that the only industry in the world that doesn't pay to have its garbage taken out is the fossil fuel industry. If you want to run a restaurant, if you run a business, I mean, we generate paper here at the, for our radio and TV program. We pay to have the garbage taken out. The fossil fuels industry's trash, and the Supreme Court has agreed with this, is carbon dioxide. And they do not pay to have that taken out. Instead, they dump it into our air, and we pay to have it taken out in the form of paying for the cost of hurricanes and mile-wide tornadoes. And these are the externalities of the fossil fuel industry, in addition to cancers and things associated with, the high fractions of petroleum that are the result of burning fossil fuels and the mercury from burning coal and all these other things. They don't pay for any of this stuff.
I don't think the American public gets that connection. The fact is that they're paying. They understand They understand subsidies. They understand. Yes, we're giving the oil industry $40 billion a year for this, or $100 billion from taxpayers to prop them up during a period where they're making $40 billion a year. Exxon and Chevron and BP, $30 to $40 billion a year, but nevertheless, taxpayer money's going into that. That's obvious if you're paying attention, but those external costs are what most people miss, don't they?
That's absolutely right. I mean, this in a way, this is kind of the Reaganomics model, which is maximize internal profits and do away with external costs. It's one of the reasons why so many American factories, where they had to pay for their externalities like pollution, not carbon dioxide pollution, but just good old-fashioned poison pollution, or having the trash taken out, or they had to pay for the impact on the community in terms of social welfare and things by paying taxes. They moved from the United States to countries that don't charge for those externalities, countries like China. But with the fossil fuel industry, it's their major externality is carbon dioxide, and they have never paid for it. And the only way to get them to pay for it is to institute a carbon tax, and then use that money to do things like reimburse the families of these firefighters.
Tom, explain how the carbon tax works and why the rest of the world is understanding that, at least China and the European market, but we don't seem to get that, do we?
Yeah, China in Shenzhen 2 weeks ago, they started a cap and trade program that involves carbon cost for carbon. The European Union has been doing it since 2006. Denmark has been doing this for much longer than that. Basically, back when Denmark looked at this over a decade ago, they said, what is the cost to our healthcare system? They weren't even looking at rising oceans. What's the cost to our healthcare system of the cancers that people get from the poisons that come out of car exhaust pipes? And they calculated that and said, okay, it works out to about $1 a gallon. So they raised the price of gasoline by that, added that to the tax and funneled that into their healthcare system. That's an example of capturing that cost. When you look at the raw externalities associated with burning fossil fuels, the cancers, the things that the things that can be emphysema, the things that can directly be defined, it looks like those externalities associated with carbon dioxide, probably $20, $30, $40 a ton of carbon dioxide would be a reasonable starting point for a carbon tax.
Okay, so what we see, how do we get there, Tom? Unless we revamp Citizens United, unless we take money out of politics. If you look at the numbers, the last article I saw that you wrote about this, almost $240 million in political candidate kind of money that flowed from the oil industry. 75% of it went to Republicans. Some of them were clearly bought Republicans, and we're never going to change that. But that's a great investment for the oil company, because in buying that, you buy a congressman like Lamar Smith, for example, who becomes your voice. That Lamar Smith, he may not accomplish anything on his own, but he's the person that you have bought to go out there and fight your fight for you. I mean, Coburn, there's a lot of these guys out there that have been bought and paid for. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. This is one of the best investments going. You invest $100 million, you make back tens of billions of dollars. You can't make money like that in the stock market. You can't make money like that in manufacturing. Right now in the United States, the best investment in this country is buying members of Congress. And yes, the only way to undo that is to go around the Supreme Court and amend the Constitution to say two very simple things. Money is not free speech under the First Amendment, and corporations are not people under any part of the Constitution. They are artificial entities. And let me add, by the way, very quickly, if we put a carbon tax into place at around the $25 to $40 threshold, which is, again, considered very, very, very modest and only capturing a fragment of the externalities. At that point, if the carbon fuel industry, fossil fuel industry had to pay for their waste, all of a sudden solar and wind and geothermal become more economical than any of the fossil fuels. You would see an instant transition to renewable energies worldwide.
Tom, right now we see China is the new leader for carbon emissions and pollution in the environment, but at least whether it's real, it appears to be real. What I read and what I see appears to be real is China's effort to get ahead on the alternative energy fight, because they realize if they win that, they're going to be able to save a lot of money to the GDP. They're going to be able to really advance by taking that money that they would have squandered on fossil fuel and making it up in alternative resources. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think that your analysis is spot on. There's a bunch of other subtleties to it. One, China is one of the physically largest countries in the world, and there's a lot of rural areas. And in rural areas where there is no electricity at all, they can instantly leapfrog the entire fossil fuel part of the evolutionary cycle of electricity and go from no electricity to solar electricity just like that. And that's happening big time across Africa right now. That's happening big time across China and rural China. and to some extent in rural India as well. Number one. Number two, they're looking at, you've got companies now that are saying, we're going to leave Beijing, we're going to leave Shanghai because our employees are not willing to work in this polluted an atmosphere. They don't want to raise their children in this polluted an atmosphere. And so they're freaking out about that. It's just bad for business. I mean, especially after they've invested trillions in infrastructure. Number three, they've got a lot of people living on the seacoast, and the Chinese are looking at this science, and they got no right-wing religious zealots saying Jesus is going to come and make all things new. You know, this is an old Confucian country, and they understand reality, and they're saying we got to do something about this. And number four, they're looking at the entire world. They know within the next decade is going to take this seriously because it's irrefutable, and they're looking at becoming the world's leading manufacturer of wind and solar devices.
Yeah, well, it becomes a product that we have kind of paid attention to. I look at what Obama has done on the energy front. What is your take? If you were to give him a rating as to what he's actually accomplished, what would that be?
It would be a D. Too little, too late. He gave a great speech the other day. I mean, he's really good at giving great speeches. And in his speech, he said, a year from now, I'll figure out some new standards for the EPA. And a year from that, which will be, just a few months before he leaves office, I'll put them into place, probably.
Well, the other part of it, I mean, if you look at the track record, it's not very impressive. You have him where he's speeded up the idea of being able to do deep ocean drilling. I don't know really where he's going to fall in the XL pipeline. I'm very suspect of that. He's actually speeded up the ability for the production in coal-burning plants to emit arsenic and mercury and all other things. He's actually enabled that to happen. And there's a lot of stuff that could happen by executive order that we think should happen, but it doesn't seem to be moving. Do you see that happening maybe these next few years?
I hope so. The criticism of President Obama is very legitimate. At the same time, we have to realize that there's a lot of moving pieces to this. If he had the legislation that Nancy Pelosi actually passed out of the House of Representatives with regard to alternative energy and funding alternative energy as part of a stimulus program, then we would be making that transition to alternative energy really, really fast in the United States.
Right.
As president, he also has to deal with the national security issue, the fact that we're importing oil from very, very unstable countries. So from that point of view, just from the national security point of view, he's got the Pentagon telling him, we really need to dial back on the oil we're bringing in from Venezuela and from Saudi Arabia and from other countries that might not be there for us when we need them, and developing domestic sources. And then Congress says, okay, that's great. The only domestic source we're going to let you develop is fossil fuels. Yeah. And so that's what he's been doing. I don't agree with it, but I understand it.
Thom Hartmann, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pap.
Coming up, we'll find out why America's middle class has become an endangered species. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. America's middle class has been squeezed by corporations to the point that they're disappearing. Wages have been slashed, benefits are gone, and health care costs are skyrocketing. Joining me now to talk about the extinction of the American middle class are attorneys Joe Cotchett and Dave TeSelle. Gentlemen, startling statistic. I mean, the statistics, the latest statistics coming out on the economic divide in America are just horrendous. The world's 100, this is the latest, the world's 100 richest people earned a stunning $240 billion in 2012. And that, gentlemen, was enough money to end extreme poverty worldwide 4 times over. And unfortunately, in the U.S., it's reflected here in our economy. Joe, have you ever seen it like this?
I never have, and it's getting worse every single day. 100 million people here in America, 1/3 of the population, lives right about the poverty line. Now, what we forget about when we talk about the middle class, we forget about that top 1%. So since 2010, since the recession in 2007, 2008, CEOs' salaries have increased 25 to 30% in 2 years. Think about that. Think about where that top 400 people is going. that has the wealth of about 150 million people in this country. And what do we know? We know from history, when people cannot live a decent life, you have future problems.
You do. David, Horatio Alger, the myth is even deader than it was 10 years ago. What's your take? People have to believe in something. Horatio Alger has been a myth for a very long time, but now it's becoming almost black humor to even talk about the Horatio Alger Dare to Be Great in America myth. If you look at these numbers, they're startling.
It's absolutely startling. When the 400 wealthiest Americans have the same combined wealth as the 150 million bottom Americans, that tells you that there is a real problem here. We have a loss of the American dream that's going on with the loss of the middle class. Without the belief in the ability to advance, in the opportunity for us to do better, for our children to live better than we did as we grew up, without that, the society and our economic system cannot be sustained.
Joe, you know, there are a lot of folks out there, and I'm seeing it more now than I ever have. A lot of the voices coming from progressive voices, and it is that, you know, the American public brought this on themselves for being so damn stupid. You know, they started buying into the idea of trickle down. They had this borax soap salesman from your state there in California, Ronald Reagan, convincing them if you give billionaires more money, it's going to trickle down and everything's going to be better for you. And you see a lot of kickback from progressive. They're saying, you know, what the hell? These people, they were so stupid and so misled that this is where they are, and you know, so be it. I don't feel like that, but that notion is out there, isn't it?
Well, I don't want to use the word stupid, and I don't want to call them misled. They were taken advantage of by Washington because the money plays the part in Washington. We've discussed this in the past. The problem is that we're forgetting about that lower rate of distribution of wealth. Look, buying power is what allows the middle class to expand. Here's the problem with buying power. What the wealthy have done is created an extraordinary amount of lending power to the detriment of that middle class. Our savings have gone down, 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 and the government goes right along with the program of pushing buy more, spend more, but the minimum wage still stays where it is. Therein lies the problem.
Yeah, but David, how many elections does it take for the American public to understand that trickle down was just it was an utter joke? I mean, the idea of giving a billionaire corporation more money, not taxing them, letting them do what the hell they want to do from an economic standpoint, that if you do all those things, you don't regulate, you don't take them to court, you don't put any kind of restrictions on anything they do, that if you do those things, everything's going to be okay. Now, that is not a new notion, David. That notion was pitched all the way back to Ronald Reagan. That was a hell of a long time ago, and the American public, to some degree, still buys into that.
I think
what is that about?
I think that the Chamber of Commerce, I think that Wall Street, I think that the right wing has done an amazing job of scaring the American public, that if you do anything that affects the ability of businesses to increase their profits, of the rich to make money, that they won't hire anymore, that no more jobs will be hired. But what we learned, and this is very important, one of the big lessons of the 2008 collapse, in my view, is that it shows that when profits rise and the rich make more money, that doesn't mean that they're going to go out and hire more employees. They don't. The big collapse was caused because of the leverage that Joe was talking about, the fact that there was cheap money, that the rich people are doing things like derivatives, investing in these securities that are just fantasy land, trying to make a quick buck without actually hiring more employees.
In other words, Joe, they don't make anything, do they? They didn't take this money and say, okay, well, we're going to manufacture a new widget, we're going to build a new building, build new bridges, we're going to make a new type of car. What they did is they came up with this completely fraudulent scheme of derivatives, swaps, synthetics, paper that never benefits this economy at all, and they kept their money basically. The billionaires kept their money, didn't put anything back by this process of the derivative scams, did they?
Let's go back just for a minute to what David said and emphasize that, because that to me is the critical problem. They pronounce this edict that if you hire more, okay, excuse me, if the wealthy make more money, they can hire more. The point David just made. Let's keep it as simple as that, because that to me is the key. So what happened last year? The top 500 CEOs in this country averaged $26 million. Now let me tell you a shocker. In many of the companies where they made that average $26 million, the shareholders lost money. But they say, look, we need to keep making profits for the wealthy because then we can increase employment. That's what David just said, the hiring factor. That is sheer, unadulterated nonsense. What you have to do is take away. You want the classic example? Everybody's ranting and raving right now about public pensions. Public pensions. Poor person works for 25 years, 30 years for a little city, a little county, and goes off and gets maybe 25%, 30%, 40% of their salary. So they make maybe $25,000, $50,000 for the rest of their life, as long as they live in a pension. Have you ever heard the term golden parachutes? You want to hear about golden parachutes? Last year, CEOs took out of the economy $250 billion in golden parachutes across the country, actually across the world. I apologize. It's not limited to.
It's a startling number.
States.
David, let me go to you just a second. If we take this back, and again, these numbers, they're almost too horrendous to take to memory. So let me give them to you. Pre-tax corporate profits topped $1.7 billion last year. 30 major corporations paid no income tax over the last 3 years, while they made $170 billion in profits. Listen to this, guys. 412 billionaires in the United States control almost 40% of our wealth in the country today. 15%, and that's while 15% of our population lives in poverty. Now, okay, show and tell, David. What about this president? What has he done besides been out on the speech stump talking about how horrible it is? What moves have you seen to see him correct this? Well, we've seen him try to make the attempt to increase wages, but give me your next. Give me your next.
You know, my read is he clearly has not gone near far enough. We've heard a lot of good speeches, a lot of good words about income inequality and the need for the middle class to grow. He said the right thing, but we really need to push this further. I mean, the American people want fairness. One of the benefits, Mike, that I saw, one of the positives that I saw is that there was a Washington Post poll at the end of 2012 that showed that more people in America now are concerned about fairness in income equality than they are about regulation or over-regulation in the markets. That's fascinating because that hasn't been the case for the past 30 years. People are now.
Joe, let me go to you. Joe, let me go to you. Wall Street has the money. Okay, that's where all this money that I just talked about, that's where it is. It's on Wall Street. Okay, is this a president that has coddled Wall Street, or has he tried to make them become more responsible, in your take?
So the simple answer is he is coddled, but let's look at the reason just for a moment, because I want to come to his defense in this sense. Look, when Franklin Roosevelt was faced with the problem in the 1930s, our fathers and grandfathers dealt with it in a way that Washington worked. When Lyndon Johnson faced the same problem in the 60s, he dealt with it with the war on poverty because Wall Street didn't have the influence. Obama cannot stand up to Wall Street. The great majority of Washington representatives are bought and paid for. By that I mean bought and paid for. They're influenced by the money guy who comes down the hall with a bag of money.
Okay,
and
David, but let me throw David, you can do something though. You can arrest Wall Street scammers who steal $18 trillion from the American public. You can arrest the folks at Bank of America when it's very obvious that they've stolen from homeowners. You can arrest the CEO of a corporation that's doing business with a drug cartel. We've seen none of that with this president, have we?
We've seen none of it. I mean, it's now been 5, 6 years and counting. Not one person has gone to jail for what happened in 2008. And it was a crime. It was a crime by large corporations against middle America, against Main Street, what happened with the collapse. And nobody's gone to jail. This president hasn't done that. So I respectfully...
Isn't that how you correct the problem, David? Don't you say, look, if you do this, you go to jail. In about 30 seconds, tell me how else you correct the problem.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. I think what we need is a stronger president or presidential effect on Wall Street and keeping them in line. But what the Republicans and the right wing are looking for is a return to the 19th century Gilded Age, where it's the robber barons, it's the big corporations that control everything, and government is in eternal gridlock like Congress has been during the Republican Congress control.
Joe, David, let's hope that in the next several years things do turn around and we see action matching up with talk. That's what we can hope, because right now the disparity in this country is deplorable. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll find out how corporate America is preventing the government from enacting life-saving regulations. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. When it comes to putting regulations in place that save American lives, corporate America has put their best lobbyists to work to stall or prevent those regulations from being put in place. Joining me now to talk about corporate America's drive to deregulate us to death is Farron Cousins from the Trial Lawyer magazine. So Farron, if you're a president or a legislator and you want to make the American public believe that you're actually taking action by passing some bill or passing an executive order, but you don't really want anything to happen, what do you do with it?
You send it to the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. That is where all good regulations go to die. You get out there on the stump, you come up with all these grand plans that we're going to rein in, these corporate fat cats on Wall Street. We're going to take charge on these environmental polluters. And then you send those regulations to the OIRA, where essentially nothing happens for years and years and years.
It's a great scam because it does allow the politician to tell his voters that, I'm doing something when he knows he's going to make it disappear. What do the numbers look like? Just give us a sense of what are the numbers of bills that move into this OIRA and disappear and nothing ever happens.
Well, right now, the way the system works is that the Congress will come up with a regulation and they'll send it off to the OIRA, and they have 90 days to respond or to enact the regulations. And right now, I believe there's about 120 regulations that have been sitting there over past due, some of them by as much as 5 or 6 years. That's how long they've been sitting there waiting to be enacted. But both Bush, when he was in office, and Obama have just been sitting on them, doing absolutely nothing. And in the meantime, people are dying as a result of these regulations not being put in place.
Give us some examples. Give us a couple of examples of just how serious this is. This isn't just minor regulations. These are regulations that really do go to the heart of whether people live or die, right?
They do. And I think one of the most important ones that's been stalled is this backup monitoring system for vehicles. This was brought about by a 2-year-old boy who was killed when his father in the driveway accidentally backed over him. So the regulations came up that we're going to put backup monitoring systems on all new cars. Well, instead of actually doing anything, the auto industry lobby got their hands on the White House, met with the president countless times with no other audience. There's no record of what happened during those conversations. And to this day, that regulation has not been put in place. And this is in spite of the fact that we know thousands of people die every single year from being backed over by an automobile. And they've done the math, and they know that if they enact this particular regulation, if they make auto companies put backup monitoring systems on their vehicles, it will save at a minimum of 100 lives every single year, if not more.
Farron is editor of the National Trial Lawyer magazine. You are a clearinghouse for these stories. You've been doing this for years. You've seen the stories coming in for years where a piece of legislation will be passed and the general public is jubilant. Oh, great, this is going to solve the problem. It's going to stop the pharmaceutical companies from making products that kill us. It's going to stop the automobile industry from making defective products. And the person out there really believes something's going to happen. And the people who pass it use this methodology time and time again. Tell us the story about silica. Isn't that another one of those stories?
Silica is, countless workers in this country are exposed to silica dust every day, usually in the construction and manufacturing. And this is a substance that gets in the lungs, causes severe diseases. And Congress, the White House, scientists have known about this for decades. And to this day, that regulation is still sitting in that OIRA office waiting to be enacted. And again, it's the same story like with the backup monitoring system. The industry sends out their best lobbyists, sometimes even CEOs. They meet specifically with the president. They meet in the Oval Office sometimes. The doors are closed. There's no public knowledge of what's being said, what's going on. But as we can clearly see from the evidence, they're telling the president, hey, listen, if you put this regulation in place, it's going to cost us a little bit of money. So,
tell us how this affects. I mean, one great example to me that I think people don't understand is people think that after Wall Street committed the crimes that they committed and crashed our economy, stole $18 trillion from American taxpayers, that after that happened, that Dodd-Frank came along and Dodd-Frank cured all that. Now we don't have any problems. Tell us the truth about Dodd-Frank and OIRA and SEC and all the other regulatory agencies.
Well, in its most basic form, Dodd-Frank really doesn't do anything. Dodd-Frank came out and said we need to we need to come up with a system to identify fraud, to rein in speculators. It basically told them to come up with the formula on how to do that. And as soon as Dodd-Frank, became an idea, Wall Street sent their lobbyists and their attorneys into Washington.
And so what ends up happening, Farron, if I got this right, the pressure comes from the lobby groups. The lobby groups go to Wall Street, for example, goes to a particular congressman. The congressman then has all kinds of ways to further slow down the process once the bill goes to the OIRA. The congressman can say we have to have some more hearings on it. You need to go to OIRA and present your position. And it's always a one-sided position. I mean, you don't have consumers that get the opportunity to appear in front of the OIRA, but you certainly have lobby groups that pay big money to congressmen so they can go bend the ear and change the law by way of the OIRA. And it's not just the OIRA, but that's kind of the methodology, isn't it?
Correct. I mean, I don't know of any consumers, a group of concerned citizens that have gone and been able to have an audience with a congressman, or certainly not the president. But I think what's important about the OIRA is the fact that in January of 2007, George Bush, he knows he's leaving office soon. He's got to give his corporate masters one last big present. And what he gave them was an executive order that significantly increased the White House's control over the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And so now, before any regulation can go out, a lobbyist and industry group can come in there and say, wait, you need more studies. There's not enough studies on this.
So let's put this.
This could affect the economy. This could affect our ability to be competitive in the marketplace. And Bush specifically put that language in that executive order. So now they're tethered to this, and Obama just seems more than willing to play right along with this executive order that he could easily undo.
Well, and he is the master. I mean, truth be told, Obama is the master of the stump speech that sounds great, and then no action that flows from that great stump speech. So this is perfect for Obama. This is, if you think about it, his siding with Wall Street has been almost overwhelming time and time again, the lack of prosecutions, the lack of the intensity with which he has empowered Wall Street even more. And so when he's out there talking about Dodd-Frank on the stump speech or in the media, he knows what's happened to Dodd-Frank. He knows that it's fallen into the black hole. Isn't that kind of how it works?
That is, and again, most of it is coming from these lobbyists. When you read about lobby money, when you read about, political donations, this is what it's for. This is why politicians get money from these massive corporations. A fantastic example of a regulation that has been stalled because of industry influence is the coal ash. And coal ash is what's left over after they burn coal for electricity. And so an entire industry has emerged to reuse this toxic coal ash in society. And it contains, cadmium, mercury, lead, arsenic, things that are deadly in and of themselves that cause cancer. But now, because there's been no regulations, Obama's had, I think, a dozen meetings with industry insiders. There is now an industry that sells coal ash. They use it to de-ice roads in the winter. They're pouring this toxic substance on our roadways. It's getting tracked into people's homes. They're using it to make bricks and concrete. I mean, this stuff is all over the place. And Bush first and now Obama have refused to act on this. And that one is becoming a very serious issue, especially with the Kingston coal ash spill a few years ago.
But Farron, isn't this one of those stories? Don't you remember when there was this big fanfare and parade about, by God, Obama's doing something about the coal industry? Don't you remember that? And it was this great fanfare. This is a president who cares. This is a president who's going to change something. And then all of a sudden now we're learning that the way that he stopped all of it was just to say, okay, lobbyists, go tell your story as long as you want, as often as you want, as one-sided as you want, as corrupt as you want, and the bill doesn't go anywhere. Well, look, what about the food industry? I mean, we've seen all these laws coming out about we need safer food. Food imports are killing people. I think something like 60 to 80% of the imported vegetables and fruits, for example, come from all over the world, not just this country. So we needed to gain control over monitoring that. Did we?
Oh, absolutely not. I think at this point only about 2% of our imported food is actually inspected. And as a result, just a couple years ago, we imported, a bunch of chilies from Mexico. They went out to the Midwest, and people started getting salmonella from these chilies because nobody inspected it.
But we were told, here's the point. We were told that there are new laws on the books that are supposed to be protected. People would die. There'd be a salmonella outbreak. People would die, and the congressman or the president would say, we have this under control. We have new laws that are solving this. Where did it go as it went into that black hole?
Just where all the other ones go to the OIRA is sitting on it, effectively killing it. But that's the thing. These politicians are able to go out there and tell the American public that we have developed new rules that are going to make your food safer, it's going to make your environment cleaner, it's going to make Wall Street more honest, it's going to make your vehicle safer. And they can say that and they aren't lying. But what they're not telling is the second part of the story, that, yeah, we came up with these regulations, but we're letting the industry have their way with these regulations before they're enacted. And even if they do get enacted, it still takes years before they're actually enforced. So
yeah, on this issue alone, just food real quickly, I mean, 48 million Americans get sick from imported foods. 120,000 are hospitalized. 3,000 die. That's been taking place again and again ever since they said they were going to do something, which was really as early as 2010, when they said, well, we've got this under control, we're going to do something. So people continue to die. In about 30 seconds, do you see any way to really turn this around while the lobby money's out there?
With the lobby money, I really don't, unfortunately. But Obama has the power, and he does respond well to public pressure. If the public gets out there and demands that he issues an executive order to get these lobbyists out of the OIRA, then perhaps we could do something, or maybe speed up the process in some way. He responds to pressure, and that's what we have to do.
Yeah, that seems like the only thing he responds to. Thank you, Farron, for joining me.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll see how countries around the globe are reacting to wage and benefit cuts. We'll be right back, so stay with us right here on Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Across the globe, corporations are taking advantage of the working class, but in a lot of the countries, workers are starting to fight back against corporate greed. Joining me now to talk about the global revolt of the middle class is investigative journalist Rick Outzen. Rick, exploitation, I mean really extreme exploitation of workers is usually not sustainable, is it? I mean, don't you always have the system trying to find equilibrium, no matter whether it's China, India, anywhere in the world, you're going to have that worker-employer kind of a relationship that does look for equilibrium of some kind, right?
They do. You know, people want to have a better life for themselves and their families, so they're going to seek that. And democracy and freedom do rise up. We saw it with the Arab Spring. We're now seeing what seems to be a workers' revolt, a middle class in Brazil, Germany, India, China. We're starting to see that the middle class, the workers, are stepping up and demanding more of them, of their employers and their governments.
Well, you know, Rick, it seems like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce unleashed this Chip Starnes kind of character, kind of a hustler, low-end kind of employer that shows up in places like China and sets up a sweatshop, you know, of sorts. We used to expect that with the big clothing industry, the tech industry, and now the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has this formula where they're telling all American businessmen to go ahead and outsource jobs and look for that low pay, no regulation, no benefit, no age requirement kind of solution to the workforce. Isn't that what we're seeing? Isn't that what happened with Chip Starnes here?
Oh, it is. You know, Chip Starnes is a medical specialties company in China right outside of Beijing. He goes there to lay off 30 workers, and they keep him in the factory until he signs agreements that he is going to pay them fairly and let their jobs stay there. Now, the chamber makes it out like it's a huge he was, he was held captive for a long period of time. You know, he had his phone, he had food, he had a restroom.
Rick, when I looked at the picture, I kind of felt like he was right where he should have been. So let me ask you, what is the shift that takes place? Doesn't a shift take place where you have one generation of maybe unskilled factory workers? They come in, they do this work for nothing, and then they have children, and their children have children, and generation after generation it changes. Now it's more of a tech kind of a workforce, isn't it?
Right, it's a more skilled worker, it's more skilled type of environment that they're working in, so they have to be better educated, so they to understand how to produce the products that they're producing. And so it changes the chemistry of this to where this isn't a sweatshop. These are educated workers who've gotten a taste of having a good life. And this factory had been there for 10 years that they're trying to close. By the way, they're closing to move it to India to find another area that they can exploit.
Right. And those are the stories where we hear about factories burning down and people burning to death, and because there are no regulations. But I think the ugly part of this story is the average person out there believes the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one of them. They believe, the average American says, yeah, I have some kinship with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that has created this system of sending jobs out of the country. to third world countries. And do you remember, Rick, when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually fought against the campaign that was taking place in America to buy American? Doesn't that give us some insight here?
Well, it does. You know, this is, some would consider it treason, Mike, that you would want to let jobs leave this country and go to another place. And, you know, there was an era when we were proud of the jobs we were creating. And it's still sort of kind of a paradox here, because we're listening to governors across this country brag about how they're developing jobs, and the chamber, which is backing these Republican governors, is, you know, telling their members, take your jobs overseas.
Well, we have, for example, the governor of Florida, most of the Republican governors traveling back and forth to China and India, you know, monthly, trying to say, yeah,
Right.
well, we want our businessmen to set up over there in your country, and they realize that they're taking jobs from Florida or, you know, New Jersey, wherever it may be. They're moving jobs out of their state, and in the end, the person who suffers, of course, is the American public, because a couple of things happen. The job goes overseas. We lose it on that end. The company that sends the job overseas then takes the money, puts it in an offshore bank, so we don't get the tax benefit of that. And the governor there that wants this new globalization has accomplished nothing but to hurt his voters. Don't you see that time and time again?
You know, and we do. And the other piece, Mike, is the quality of work that we're getting. So often we're seeing, you know, scares with faulty equipment, faulty medical supplies. We're seeing that happen and so we're not even getting the quality that we should get. But what's encouraging to me, Mike, is we're starting to see these workers are human beings. They're standing up for their rights and for the rights, you know, to have a decent wage, to be able to take care of their family. And it's happening all over the country now. This is a really
all over the world,
different world. All over the world,
yeah.
right? Excuse me, all over the world. This is a different environment now. One, I don't think they could put the cat back in the bag now. This is really starting to move.
One thing about it, in a place like China or India, they're not afraid to grab the CEO and put him behind bars. They're not afraid to strike. They're not afraid to rebel. They're not afraid to be militant. Even more so, if you really think about it, in about 20 seconds, more than the United States workers, they're willing to push back.
They are, and that's what's encouraging. You know, maybe we need a little bit of that here, Mike.
Yeah, well, if we could just rebuild the importance of the American Union,
Right.
we can save workers' future. We can save this economy if we can rebuild the American labor force, the American union force in this country. Very important that be accomplished. Thanks for joining me, Rick.
Thank you, Mike.
America's healthcare system is failing, mostly because large healthcare corporations are making it impossible for underprivileged Americans to get decent care. I have attorney Ben Gordon here to help explain the problems of corporatized medicine. Ben, I think the medical profession is finally figuring out that corporations are now involved with every decision that they make when it comes to patient care. I mean, they no longer have their practice. It's run by MBAs, graduates from MBA school who have no medical background running medical practice these days.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, some of us remember Marcus Welby, MD, and I think the days of the true solo practitioner who is able to really care for his patient in a well-rounded, humanistic way are gone. You know, these corporations, these hospitals that are buying up these medical practices are setting the physicians up to be at a conflict. I mean, how can they look as their number one goal just to take care of their patient if, in fact, their compensation is based on whether or not they bring a lipid down to a certain level by prescribing a statin or bringing sugar down?
Okay, let me talk about some examples. How is it done? An MBA tells a doctor, they give him a corporate guideline. Is that kind of what we see here? It's literally it's a corporate guideline written out step by step about what a doctor can do and what a doctor can't do. A doctor, for example, may in the past have wanted to spend 30 minutes with a patient, and the MBAs now tell them, no, you can only spend 15 minutes. Lay out how much in control corporate America is.
Well, I mean, it's pervasive. I think the AMA's own statistics show that between 2005 and 2010, the number of physician-owned practices versus hospital or corporate-owned practices declined from something like 70% owned by the physician down to well under 50%. So more than half of the practices in this country are owned by the corporations, so the corporations control everything. They tell the doctors how long they can spend. You know, people who don't even have, in some cases, a 4-year degree, much less a medical degree, are making, you know, bean counters are making decisions for physicians on whether they should see a patient for a certain length of time and whether or not they should prescribe a certain therapy based on how much it benefits the hospital.
Okay, well, we used to hear that we thought that was going on. Now the studies are very clear that that is what's going on, that we have somebody in New York making a decision for how somebody can care for somebody down in Florida, making a telephone call, say, doctor, you're spending too much time with patients. You are not, for example, you mentioned statins. Lay that out. In other words, a doctor is ordered, you must prescribe a statin because you don't want to spend the money on alternative type of therapy. Explain how that works.
Yeah, and that's a great example. Lipid-lowering drugs, statins as they're called, such as Crestor and Lipitor, you know, have not been proven safe. They cause a lot of problems, and yet that is the one, you know, benchmark that physicians are told to use in their practice. If a man reaches a certain age and has slightly elevated cholesterol, they automatically give them that statin, and the reason is that that benefits the doctor and the hospital financially to prescribe that drug, which costs them very little, which the profit margin is very high, and in turn the patient may or may not have his entire picture looked at. The doctor may not really be looking at other factors such as diet and exercise and smoking, and just in and of itself prescribing that statin in order to try to get the cholesterol down to a range that there's no real evidence that suggests that that will make the person less at risk for heart disease. The fact
Okay,
is,
so the corporate, and again, I can't stress this enough, these are actual corporate guidelines that you've seen and I've seen that lay out specifically how long a doctor can spend with a patient, no matter how critically ill the patient is, what the doctor must prescribe, no matter whether the doctor makes the judgment that this is not the thing to prescribe or not. And if they don't do that, they're financially penalized. Isn't that the way that it works for a doctor under the new corporate-run hospital?
That's right.
Isn't that kind of where we've headed?
Exactly. The hospitals control the decisions. The hospitals tell the doctors your bonus will be based on whether or not you prescribe enough of statins, on whether or not you prescribe enough of the sugar-lowering drugs, these new ones like Byetta and Januvia. If the sugar of your patient is slightly elevated, you've got to give them that drug. Your financial independence may depend on it. And what's the doctor going to do? The days of being a doctor being able to sit back and look at the patient's entire, you know, profile and decide what's best for them holistically and in a broad-based medical scientific-based approach are gone. They have to prescribe the drug that's going to get those numbers where the hospitals want them to get them.
And if the doctor determines that the patient doesn't want to buy, for example, a lot of people understand statins are poison, they don't take statins, and a patient may say, I don't want to take a statin. They actually end up firing the patient rather than saying, well, here's some homeopathic kind of alternatives for lowering your cholesterol. A patient is fired, and the doctor is fired and or penalized by the corporation that now owns his or her practice. And the loser really is just the patient. I mean, the loser is the patient, and at the end of this story, it doesn't appear that that's going to change. Matter of fact, the numbers are increasing. Ben Gordon, thank you for joining me. This is a story that we better pay attention to if you are planning on having any medical care in the future. Thank you for joining me.
No question. Thanks, Pat, for having me.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.